Today is Academy Awards Sunday, so it seems like a good day to tell you this. My partner and I never go to the movies. This feels like something of a personal failing, because we like the idea of supporting filmmakers, especially those who take risks, and we like the idea of supporting neighborhood movie theaters, and we actually could use a little more Hollywood escapism in our lives to counter our daily overdoses of news. But in terms of getting ourselves in the car and driving the whole mile to the theater, it almost never happens. Literally, years can go by. And yet, just last month, after a long drought, we made it happen. We were on vacation in a small town. We had a free evening. There was kind of nothing else to do. So we went and saw the obvious cinematic choice for two men over 50, Little Women. Of the 20 or so people in the theater, we were the two tallest, and as best we could tell, we were two of the three males present. We both really enjoyed the film. And we both really enjoyed continuing a tradition that goes back way farther than our tradition of never going to movies. Our tradition of disregarding what is expected of our gender. I have a hazily remembered but similar story from my middle school years, when a group of kids and parents from my neighborhood were heading to the movies. I believe the boys were going to see Rocky II, a movie about boxing. I believe the moms and girls were going to see Kramer versus Kramer, a drama about divorce. I had zero interest in watching men physically beat on each other, so I went to Kramer versus Kramer with the moms and the girls. Contrary to what underinformed people might fear, this so-called chick flick did not impact my sexual orientation or my gender identity. Those were already in progress. Rather, my choice of film spared me from having to watch toxically masculine racialized violence and to pretend to find it entertaining. My hometown wasn't the worst place to be a boy who wanted to follow his own drummer, but it wasn't the best place either. Just a bit ago, we heard our choir sing beautifully a song from Billy Elliot, a movie and stage musical that tells the inspiring story of a boy who wanted to dance. As you probably know, Billy succeeds in becoming an amazing dancer, finding the electricity in it, and he does so even in the face of oppressive gender expectations. When I was a boy, I also had an interest in dancing, but my own experience in the real world was very different. I'd seen guys like Fred Astaire dance in old movies on TV, and I thought it would be a cool thing to try. There were all kinds of dance programs in my hometown, but there was not a single male involved as teacher or student. I signed up for a tap class anyway, and I went. I remember that the teacher was very nice, but she had no idea what to do with me in a room full of girls. And I certainly did not display exceptional talent that, necessitated seeking out better education on this. I only went to the class once. It was just too awkward for everybody. To this day, I still love to dance, and I occasionally wonder what might have been had I grown up in a time and place less constricted by traditional gender roles. But overall, I just take great joy, in seeing a wide range of options available to today's kids of all genders. Our theme this month here at FUS is resilience, and today I'm taking a look at the intersection of gender and resilience. I've shared these couple of stories with you because I know that many of you have lived these kinds of stories, perhaps in your past and perhaps very much as part of your present reality. Stories about boxes you've stepped out of, about gender expectations you've ignored, stories about rejecting a gender binary or a gender identity that didn't work for who you truly are. I've also chosen gender and resilience as a topic because gender issues have a huge role in authoritarianism, which we as a country have just entered a new phase of, and because gender expectations have a huge role in who gets to be a leader in the United States. People of every gender, men, women, non-binary, everyone, all of us are squeezed by patriarchal systems. so gender has much to teach us about resilience. So right now, what I briefly want to talk about is this: Bernie Sanders and his hair. As you know, ministers cannot endorse candidates from the pulpit, but I'm not going to talk about Bernie's policies or whether anyone should vote for him or not vote for him. I can talk to you about his hair. I think most of us can picture Bernie's hair, but if you can't, it might best be described as politically independent. So with that picture in your mind, I ask this. Imagine Elizabeth Warren and Amy Klobuchar getting out of bed in the morning and letting their hair do whatever it wants in whatever direction it wants. How far would their campaigns have gotten? Nowhere. They wouldn't even have the jobs they have now. Both women are senators and Bernie's a senator, but when it comes to appearance, women have a whole different set of rules imposed upon them and a whole different level of critique. Now imagine if the two women had wild white hair and a reputation for yelling. You understand what I'm saying. As it is, Elizabeth and Amy are following many of the mainstream rules around gender, but are still having a more challenging time in the race. As the old quote about Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers goes, Ginger did all the same dance moves Fred did, except she did them backwards and in high heels. And Fred was still more famous. As I indicated earlier, the demands of patriarchy don't just constrain those who identify as female. They constrain everyone. I recently read a profile of Pete Buttigieg, one that analyzed his charisma and described him as sometimes coming off as awkward in personal interactions. In an interview, Pete noted that, quote, "Some people are given more room to be emotive than others." And that, quote, "As the new guy, maybe waving my arms is not the best way to convey what I care about." What's wrong with waving your arms, you ask? Well, Reverend David over here was once told as a student teacher that moving his arms too much when he spoke made him look gay. Decades later, Mayor Pete appears to be laboring under similar restrictions. In this case, Pete actually is gay, which is apparently less of a problem than appearing stereotypically gay. There are many kinds of people who aren't allowed to be expressive. This includes women who get dinged for being too emotional and then dinged again if they aren't warm. Yes? Amen, right? And it includes people of color, particularly African American leaders, who are not allowed to be angry, lest they be tagged with the angry black man, angry black woman stereotype. Barack Obama was calm by nature, which was good. America would not have accepted him any other way. In short, many of the people in our country who actually have the most to be angry about are the least permitted to express it. Meanwhile, as we are well aware, white men at the top of our national leadership have free rein to yell and rant at any hour of the day or night via any medium of their choosing. Patriarchy has a significant role in all this, but patriarchy is actually too limited of a concept for what ails us. Too limited to describe all the limits imposed on all kinds of people. There are so many overlapping factors determining who gets to do what. 30 years ago, a law professor named Kimberly Crenshaw came up with the idea of intersectionality to explain how oppressions can overlap and how people's various identities mean they experience oppression differently. Black women live under both sexism and racism. Their experience of sexism is different from how white women experience, and their experience of racism is different from how black men experience it. And queer people of color have vastly different experiences from white people who identify as LGBTQ. Intersectional analysis sometimes gets dismissed by whites on the right as identity politics. But one of Crenshaw's former students, Kevin Minofu, in an interview with Vox, described Crenshaw's intersectionality as less interested in identity and, quote, more interested in the deep structural and systemic questions about discrimination and inequality. It's not just about individuals. Racism and sexism are baked into a lot of our societal infrastructure. A few years after Crenshaw's breakthrough, the feminist theologian Elizabeth Schussler-Fiorenza coined the term kyriarchy. Kyriarchy encompasses the interconnected systems that serve to control, oppress, and dominate various groups of people. These systems, in fact, end up oppressing the majority of people when you add all the groups together. Sexism, racism, transphobia, homophobia, classism, xenophobia, ageism, and more are all used by those with more power to divide, all used by those with more power to divide and exploit those with less power. Schussler-Fiorenza created the term kyriarchy from two Greek words, kyrios, meaning master or lord, lowercase lord, and then the more familiar archos, which means ruler. A related word we've been hearing a lot lately is oligarchy, which is the rule of the few. Kyriarchy is probably not a term that's well enough known to be useful in your everyday conversations, but I've found it helpful to have a name for all the social systems that reinforce artificial hierarchies, that perpetuate oppressions, and that concentrate power in a greedy minority. It's not just about patriarchy and men. It's about whoever has power and privilege wanting to maintain and expand that power and privilege. And as we all saw, kyriarchy was on full and disturbing display this past week, with trembling senators afraid to anger an aspiring dictator, and an aspiring dictator who eagerly and terrifyingly began cashing the blank check he was given. Oppressive power grew more concentrated before our eyes, and there were more attempts to target immigrants, desecrate the natural world, and so much more. And just south of the Minnesota border, we witnessed a subtler but more systemic form of oppression. I'm just going to be blunt here. Having one of the least diverse states narrow the presidential field for everybody else is straight up systemic racism. And the Iowa caucuses actually pose an excellent lesson in differentiating racist people from racist systems. Based on the Iowans I've met, I would imagine that the vast majority of caucus participants were not white supremacists. But having Iowa go first prioritizes and elevates the voices of white citizens and is an example of white supremacy culture. I don't know if you've ever heard of any of the made-up acronyms using the letters in the word Iowa. Some of them are not very nice. But in references to the caucuses, I think the letters stand for indicative of white America. And actually, as we have known in Minnesota, holding caucuses instead of primaries is itself problematic in terms of classism and exclusion. How many single parents have time to caucus? How many not single parents have time to caucus? How many people who work second shift can go to a caucus? Caucusing is a seemingly quaint tradition that only could have worked in an era that never really existed. It's an entrenched example of kyriarchy, and kyriarchy is real. And so is patriarchy, which I will demonstrate with just one more example from this last week's political mess. How many news stories from Iowa did you see that went something like this? Pete and Bernie are tied for first, and Joe Biden came in fourth. Did anyone come in third? Oh, yes, there was an older woman who came in third, and she beat Joe. So let's talk more about Joe. My partner was literally screaming in the car at the radio yesterday because this continued through the week. As you may know, Elizabeth Warren came in third, but she vanished from so much of the coverage. Erasure based on gender is so common and so easy. Nevertheless, she persisted, like so many women in so many professions. The female filmmakers of the world persist, even though all the Oscar nominees for Best Director are male this year, and they were male last year. Scholars like Kimberly Crenshaw and Elizabeth Schussler-Fiorenza will persist in adapting language to illuminate concepts that go under-examined by the patriarchal side of academia. Schussler-Fiorenza is an expert at persisting, She's still working as a professor at Harvard, and she's 81 years old. Persistence and resilience can be found all along the gender spectrum, in ways large and small, often in the face of opposition, condemnation, and much worse. And it's helpful to be reminded of stories of resilience in a time of rising authoritarianism. Resilience is part of the appeal of Little Women, especially this latest film version. Obviously, there's been a lot of social progress since Louisa May Alcott's book was published in the late 1860s. And it's important to note that the history of gender progress in America is not a story of privileged patriarchs benevolently doing the right thing. Rather, like most stories involving liberation, it is a story of those with less privilege disrupting the fate laid out for them. The fight for LGBTQ justice wasn't born recently in well-behaved legislative chambers or courtrooms. It was fueled decades earlier by transgender women of color disrupting the fate laid out for them. They fought back physically against the New York City police, who were cracking down on them for simply existing. Such stories where things get messy, may be particularly instructive right now in this historical moment, because legislative chambers and courtrooms have thus far not succeeded in stopping the fate that authoritarians have laid out for all of us. Although I had read Little Women when I was a kid, I remembered very little about the novel as we were heading into the theater. The protagonist, Jo, is the character who most chafes at the limited roles for women at the time. And there's a scene where Jo and her mother, Marmee, are talking about Jo's temper. "But you're never angry," Jo says to her seemingly calm and upbeat mother. Marmee responds, "I'm angry nearly every day of my life." This line, which surprised me, is in the original book, but it was never included in the earlier Hollywood versions. The fact that audiences get to hear it this time is a sign of progress, of seeing women as full people, as allowing them to be angry about the constraints on their lives. Little Women may be a work of fiction, but Louisa May Alcott was familiar with the struggles of her real-life mother, Abigail Alcott. Abigail, by the way, grew up Unitarian, and Louisa was connected with various Unitarian ministers and causes during her life. Like the character Marmee, Abigail Alcott raised 4 daughters in challenging circumstances in the middle of the 19th century with a dad who was not always around. Abigail once wrote in her journal, "I am almost suffocated in this atmosphere of restriction and form." She wrote that in 1842. And she once described men controlling her life as frowning down upon her and putting her into stiff quiet and peaceless order. The idea of stiff quiet appears in the novel, where Marmee talks about trying not to show her anger, and the even more difficult challenge of trying not to feel it. Marmee despairs that her anger is a sign that she is, quote, weak and wicked. I think we in this room can be grateful to director Greta Gerwig for leaving behind the idea that entirely justifiable emotions of the oppressed are somehow a sin. As the film reviewer Anthony Lane, writing in The New Yorker, put it, this newest Little Women gives, quote, a strong sense that indignation is not just the natural lot of women, but their rousing right. So, regardless of where you are on the gender spectrum, regardless of the ways that the kyriarchy diminishes your human flourishing, I hope you leave here today with a sense that indignation at injustice is your rousing right. We are living in unprecedented times that may spark any number of entirely justifiable emotions: despair, sadness, anxiety, fear, rage. May each of us see these reactions for what they are: a natural, normal response, a rousing right, a call to action, and a call to whatever types of action may become necessary, so that we might disrupt the fate others are trying to lay out for us and our country. May we be resilient, and may we be ready. May it be so.
Thanks for listening. You can find much more about humanism and what's happening at First Unitarian Society in Minneapolis by visiting our website at firstunitarian.org.